My name is Sheridan Cook. I will be your session host today, and it is my pleasure to welcome Omar Hoblos to FHIR North, I guess for a second time now around. A few housekeeping notes for those of us that are joining on the phone. Let me just progress my slide. Please do let us know if you are having audio or video issues in the chat window on the right. It's been asked to remind you it's the far right chat window. This can also be used for questions. We have a tech assistant on the line that will be sure to help you if you post about any issues that you're having. Additionally, the session is being recorded and closed captioning is available. If time allows, we'll be answering any questions that we can live at the very end of the presentation. You can submit your questions in that chat window on the right, and if we run out of time for questions, we'll let you know how you can reach out to your speaker. So let's begin and give a warm FHIR welcome to Omar Hoblos.
Hey everyone, and thank you for that, Sheridan. That was much appreciated. So just as like a quick recap, my name is Omar, and I'm one of the lead developers here at SMART, or technical implementation leads, and one of our Smart on FHIR app developers here at Smile CDR. Let me actually share my screen, and we can kind of get started. So before I begin, there's something that I always think is important when I'm discussing concepts that are in my mind or getting people who are just started into Smart on FHIR. This session will probably be geared a little more towards people who are new to FHIR. However, I think there's some nuggets of information here and there that can be pretty valuable if you've been in this for a while, or you have something that you want to share as well from your experiences here working in FHIR. So with that said, let me actually get this going. And the main thing that I want to try and do with this is change the viewpoint on Smart on FHIR or approaching it. Controversial as this take might be, experts suck at teaching what they know. And the reason for that is not because they don't know what they're talking about, but rather the perspective that experts will have, even myself sometimes, will be different than someone who's approaching this. You know, when I look at Smart on FHIR, I'm looking at things from the top down. I'm wondering what's the tech stack that's being used? Is OIDC compliant? How are the tokens being generated? Are claims in the correct format? Because oftentimes people like to do funny custom things with their tokens. But this is something that I'm aware of after working in Smart on FHIR and OIDC for a while. If I were to look at things back when I started, I'd have to learn everything from scratch. I don't know what a token is and how that actually comes into play for Smart on FHIR. And it's this big concept that everyone talks about, but we kind of, it isn't, it's better discussed now. But when I first started, it was just picking up the pace. So with this, I want to try and take the perspective of top down, try and approach Smart on FHIR from, if I were just starting, what do I need to know? What pitfalls should I be aware of? And then some other things you can do with query optimization using things like Rev Include, FHIR Path, and then talk a little bit about GraphQL and how GraphQL fits when you're building your queries versus using something like FHIR Path. So yeah, so for everyone who just joined, welcome. My name is Omar. I'm one of the tech leads, and I bring up this slide because there's a few things that I wanted to share with everyone here today. The first is actually 2 GitHub links. So working here at Smile, we're pretty well versed in writing Smart on FHIR applications, and as such, at the time we needed tooling that better helped with the type of work that we do. So the first thing that I wanted to bring up is our FHIR.ts library. And this is a pretty neat library if you're looking to integrate actual types and definitions for JavaScript and TypeScript objects in your applications. There's support for STU3 and R4, and it's available on NPM like any other node package that you'd want to start with. And it's fairly easy to get started too, by just simply importing the library, declaring a new object, and then start populating the object elements that you're working with. And by doing this, you save yourself the time and effort of trying to build custom classes and whatnot, and trying to build from scratch what the data model is in your application. I know there was a presentation yesterday about using FHIR types, and that's an excellent way of going about it as well. And Smart Health IT also has their own FHIR library for client-side JavaScript applications, which is also fantastic as well. And so for anyone that's using TypeScript related projects like Angular or are using TypeScript projects like Angular and whatnot, we find this is fairly helpful. And you save yourself the effort again of having to build all this custom tooling. I find that that's a pitfall a lot of newbies run into when they're building Smart on Fire, because they just look at the spec, they see the JSON and then try and copy paste that, not realizing there's things like set types or set amounts or set enums rather, for what actual values you can place into these fields. So I want to bring that attention because if you're working on Smart on Fire apps today and you need another way of building those application logics using type definitions and getting the benefit of having strict typing with your objects, this is probably a good way to go about it. And the second thing is if you're testing Smart on Fire or you want an application to get you started for testing, I've actually published my own test tool for testing Smart on Fire called Swiss. And it allows you to configure and manage endpoints on the application. So that way you're not focused on building an entire application and you're not focused on editing someone else's application. The only thing that someone who's either starting or testing out in your ops team or implementations team, trying to test if Smart on Fire works, you don't really care about editing code, but editing environment variables and configuration. So that's what this allows for you to do. And it does things like check tokens and tell you what's actually in them and allow you to make FHIR queries. There's actually some features today that aren't in this repo yet, but we'll probably make it in sometime by the end of next week after I'm done QAing them. And again, this is open source under Apache 2. So if you want to contribute or if you feel like you want to add something to this and need to kind of get started in terms of what would a typical Smart on Fire app be structured like, by all means, take a look at this. The code's not perfect. I'm sure someone will comb through this and say, oh, I didn't do this one thing correctly. But if you have something that you want to add or modify for it, by all means, make a pull request for it. I'm always happy to try and work with other people on getting them started for Smart and getting their environments ready to go. And we can take a look at what this app will look like later because I will be using it for parts of this demonstration. Okay, so with that said, let's hop into the presentation. So for everyone new, Smart on Fire builds a lot on OIDC or OpenID Connect. So it's important for us to review what OIDC is and how it plays into Smart on Fire and other applications as it builds the fundamentals that we need to understand for smart authorization. So let's quickly recap OAuth 2. So for OAuth 2, it's a delegated authorization framework, and that's important to keep in mind for later, that enables applications to have restricted access using scopes for a user's data. So it's more concerned with application security and permissions, not user level permissions. And we'll get into why later. And typically with OAuth 2, there's the concept of public and confidential. If you looked at the Smart on Fire spec, you probably have seen these two words pop up from time to time. Confidential essentially means that your application can be trusted to keep its secrets secure. Whereas with public, it's kind of like this application you're on right now. Someone has unrestricted access to this and could probably mess with it. So you can't really trust your open application out there to keep its secrets safe. And it's fine to either have or don't have it. The way you should think about security is more like layers, like onion layers, where you want as many layers as possible to cover a wide variety of situations. So if you're banking your whole security on a few few bits of text in your app, there's probably more you have to do for your security architecture first before going on here. Also, I believe, there we go. I will share the GitHub links shortly in the chat. So to continue going on for OAuth 2, so the end result of your flow when you're connecting with well, one of the many different ways, authorization code is the way to go about it, and I encourage you to read about that later, as as there are people way better than me that can describe how that flow works from end to end. But the essential gist of it is that you're sending your list of scopes, your client ID, and a couple other pieces to a server, and you're exchanging that detail once you've authenticated for a access or a code that you can then use for code exchange. And by the end of code exchange, if the server has validated that the code that you're sending is what it likes, you get an access token, which is probably the most important thing that you'll be working with in your application, probably more than the ID token, which we'll get into for OIDC. Because this gives you the token that you need to actually query your FHIR server. The other thing as well is that depending on the type of setup you have a refresh token. Refresh tokens are typically used in order to fetch new access tokens after the token has expired. So these refresh tokens, they're usually a really small text string that you send to the server for refresh during the refresh flow. And doing so will net you a new access token. If you ever wonder why it's easy for you to log into something and not have to relog in for a certain amount of time, it's largely because the application is doing refresh flow in the background. Depending on the library you use, I think whether you're using React or Vue or Angular, they all have some OIDC library that allows you to do this in the background, and that's called silent refresh because it happens quietly in the background. But this is useful for like a better UX, a better user experience, because you don't want them to be frustrated trying to use your application. You can disable this by default. It's really up to the implementer whether they want this or not. And that's the thing for OAuth 2 and OIDC, is that a lot of the spec is there for you to use, but you can choose what parts of it you want to actually have running for your environment. At the end of all this, we talk about tokens, and tokens are formatted in JOTs, or JSON Web Tokens. I still catch myself saying JWT, but JOT's a little funnier. I don't know. It puts a smile on my face every time I see that. And that matters because the Smart spec doesn't actually say you have to use this. Believe it or not, this is more of a de facto standard rather than implemented into the spec itself, at least the last time I read it. And it's just because this is such a convenient way of sharing information about access and how you can access other servers. And we'll look into what JOTs look like shortly, because I want to show all the tokens together on one screen. So to wrap things up for OAuth 2, again, this is a delegation protocol, which means it conveys authorization decisions and it allows application access. However, OAuth 2 is not aware of the user themselves, right? Because that's dependent on the identity provider that manages user accounts. So it doesn't do things like assign user roles, describe user roles, and enforce and manage user permissions. When you think about it, you could have a user account that has super user access, but your application only has read-only access. So the final result of that is you'll only be able to do read-only in the application. But the user themselves, if they logged into any other apps, they could do whatever they want with it. So how do you control authentication and user permissions? And that's where OIDC comes in. So it is not a replacement for OAuth 2. It's more of an extension to the OAuth 2 spec. And it solves a problem in OAuth 2 by focusing on authentication. I talked about only access tokens and refresh tokens. With OAuth 2, or sorry, with OIDC rather, we now get ID tokens that describe who the user is, and they can include things like name or like email or profile, and can be extended with custom claims like user roles. For example, this is not a real claim, but I can make one. And also has scopes that determine or inform the application about what the user can see. However, all of this is subject to implementation. So not everything is going to be available, but for the most part, OpenID and Profile are going to be the common ones you see in non-FHIR applications. In FHIR, or Smart on FHIR rather, Profile has now been depreciated or deprecated, depending on how you want to say it, for FHIR user. Functionally the same, but it's more healthcare specific, and that matters for the ID token later on. Same thing with whether it's smart or just regular OIDC, all OIDC compliant servers must have a discovery document, which is a list of URLs that tell the application where it can go to exchange token, exchange information for access. You'll probably see it as something like /well-known/OpenID configuration. This is such a standard convention. Sometimes I'll get a link from someone that says, "Hey, I don't know what to use for authorization," and just by appending this to the end, I can tell within a minute, what are they working with, unless the URL is really funky and there's something weird going on there. But because it's following an OIDC convention, it means that when you're building your Smart on Fire application, you know that any smart compliance server will have the same endpoints available to you, which means you don't have to write custom code if you're connecting to different IDPs or different FHIR servers, because they should follow the same convention, and your application, for the most part, can comfortably determine that, yeah, I'm going to use this in order to get information about log OAuth and OIDC. I mentioned the metadata endpoint here because, as you probably might see if you were in the FHIR rush for their July 1st deadline, access to the metadata endpoint on your FHIR endpoint um, describes it's a public endpoint that people need to be, or applications rather, should have access to in order to get a better understanding of what FHIR server they're connecting with. And functionally, they kind of do different things, right? Because the discovery document's more concerned with authentication and authorization, and metadata is more concerned about FHIR abilities on your server. But it's kind of the same approach because they both also talk about security, what you have access to. So when I look at this, it may be wrong to some, but I always look at this in the same way and treat it the same way as an OpenID config, because I can find details about the server and its security from metadata as well. Again, subject to implementation, because different servers may configure that and manage that differently depending on the type of setup they've got. So why does this all matter, and how do we bring this all together? So all parts that I've described earlier are used in conjunction with Smart on Fire apps. And again, Smart on Fire is a spec that builds on OIDC rather, and it describes more healthcare specific authorization details and flows that Fire applications should adhere to. So that's the custom scopes like patient and launch context sort of thing as well. So in essence, if you understand OIDC, you understand 90% of the Smart spec. I'm just going to point out something in my application real quick. If I go to my package JSON, there is nothing about this application that screams fire or smart on fire. All I need is an OIDC library. Um, the idea is that if you're able to do proper OIDC flow in your application, you've already got most of the smart stuff covered. The only things you need to take care of now is managing the tokens, the details in it, which part of that is on the server and part of that is on you, depending on the scopes that you add. So it's really the scopes and the launch context that you really need, which add to the whole smart part for an application. But otherwise, I highly encourage, if you're new, don't read the whole OIDC spec. I mean, it's a fun read, sure, if you like reading about how smart an OIDC should work, but just getting an understanding of it and how it works in other contexts besides healthcare will do a lot for you for understanding why that matters here in Smart, and then what makes it different than other deployments. So yeah, I mentioned a couple of scopes. There's a couple that I think is always worth keeping in mind when you're building your application. The two of them that pop up in my head is the patient scope. This is like launch patient or patient, and then you define what type of resources you want the application to allow either read or write access to. But this is important because by mentioning launch patient in the application, actually, let me fix that real quick because I want everyone to see the same thing that I'm seeing or thinking of. There we go. By using this scope, you add the resource ID of the patient into your access token. So this reduces the amount of work you have to do in determining the user that is logged in now has a FHIR resource associated with them. Because if you add this scope, by the end of it all, if their IDP maps the resource ID correctly to the user account, then what you should see is a scope in the access token that says patient, followed by their resource ID, which is immensely helpful when you're trying to build queries and you need to quickly fetch who the user is in session. Um, Again, this is part of this doesn't determine authentication, what the user can actually do. So bear in mind, even though you have this element in your token, it's up to you to determine the user account level permissions so that they don't have access to other patient resources and whatnot, and they can only use the patient record that's defined in the scope. We'll take a look at that later once we get into demonstrating the API calls. The other thing is FHIR user. So FHIR user is a unique scope in that it's in the ID token, and by the end of it, if you've authenticated correctly, you should get a claim in your ID token that has a link to allow you to click on that, and obviously you pass your token or whatever you need for authorization. But by the end of it, you can query your FHIR server to get details about the user as well. Kind of similar to just querying the FHIR endpoint for a patient record if you know the patient ID from the access token claim. But this builds it for you into a link in your ID token. However, one thing to keep in mind is that the FHIR user scope, or rather the output of it, depends on what the implementer wants you to do. So why that matters is the spec allows for you to change this behavior depending on your implementation, such that the FHIR URL in the FHIR user either points to a person resource, a patient resource, a practitioner, or related person. And each of those have different outputs. So you can either, if you have access and are able to work with the implementer or your FHIR server, modify the behavior so that you can have it point directly to a practitioner if a practitioner logs in, or a patient. Uh, a lot of servers will allow you to do that. The server I'm using as well will allow me as well. I just don't have that for this presentation because I don't want to focus on it. And the reason I don't want to focus on it is because in general, it's really easier just to build the query using the patient ID from your token. Either if it doesn't support the FHIR user scope, which would be very weird because that's required, or you just already are building queries dynamically. Either you have some service or component logic that builds it for you. So you could just add this as another function in it. It's not computationally any more expensive to put two strings together rather than go into a token, get a string, and then query a server using that string. So I generally tend to skip FHIR user. Maybe blasphemous to some, but because I already write services that build queries, I tend not to need it because my queries are very specifically focused on something. And so I can probably get the patient record in my query if I'm already going to be getting details like their claims or coverage or something. And you probably heard me say token time and time again. I'm probably not going to stop till the end of this presentation, but really they are your friends for this. If you're using the patient scope, then that absolutely will allow you to easily get your records and related records for the user in session because you have the record ID ready to go. And I say patient a lot, but this is interchangeable with other scopes like practitioner and whatnot. You're fine to add those as well. The end result should always be a key and a value, and that value being the record ID. Again, subject to how your server has already implemented the resource IDs for the user accounts. Whether it's something in a federated approach where your server is delegating the IDP to a third-party IDP to manage that, or your server's built-in IDP that allows you to manage record IDs and whatnot, the claim should always be there so that it's available to the application to use for later. And yeah, if you're using FHIR server and you're able to get details that are relevant to what you're doing, then by all means use the FHIR user scope. And the other thing, we talk about patient a lot, and we talk about you hear words like EHR and case management and all this stuff. And essentially, all of this is trying to bridge the gap between, or how I think we should take advantage of FHIR is that because the logic is the same between patients and practitioners, sure, the flows are different because one's more administrative, but depending on how you write your application, you don't need to write separate views for it. Because the patient record and practitioner records are somewhat treated the same, depending on what you're actually building, you don't need to write separate views and separate applications for the data to talk together. An example of this is in the case management system I wrote. There's two major parts to the application flow. There's administrative and then there's clinical. So clinical is focused on things like drug dispense, medication dispense, immunizations, and the administrative side is focused on things like care plans, is focused on questionnaires and questionnaire responses. Um, there's no need to separate their flows and their work away from each other into different apps. The way I approached it is that from the beginning, it starts with an admin trying to build up the case for an employee coming in. So they'll build the patient record, the questionnaire response, any observations that occurred, attach documents via document references, um, and immediately on the other part of this view for this application, it loads the clinical view, I'd say, and it can too take advantage of the logic that I've already written for questionnaire responses and whatnot, trying to parse them out. It can take that and then further parse that for their workflows to determine does the employee need this shot, or do they need a chart built for them within a few months or a few days. And that's all done within one application using one common data model, FHIR. Um, and so it's not often talked about, at least from what I've seen, but I highly encourage you to think differently when it comes to that, about how your administrative flow and your clinical flow can work together in your application. Because the data models are the same, it is FHIR underneath both, you can fairly easily streamline the process and the actual application you're building so that the logic that you're using in one part can be used in another. And to the end user, they don't care because you're just changing parts of the web page so that it looks more fitting for their clinical flow. But to you, the actual developer and maintainer, this is super easy because you have one code base that you have to manage, and you can very easily see where in the flow something breaks between your administrative flow and your clinical flow. And again, that's all enabled by FHIR. And speaking of gathering data, I think now would be a good time then to hop over to queries and how I approach them. And there's a lot to go into here, so I'll try and go through it as quickly as I can. Um, there's a few things that I want to touch, including how Rev Include, and iterate work, as well as where FHIR fits into this in GraphQL. And one other thing that I find is a pitfall for a lot of users when they're starting with FHIR is the actual search parameters that are available. You may have heard implementation guides thrown out here and there. The TLDR of that is that implementation guides determine what your server can actually do in terms of constraints, in terms of searching, structure definitions, and codable concepts and whatnot. But because of that, those IGs will change what searches you have access to. Oftentimes, it's usually in addition or a fix for the base core spec. So for example, explanation of benefit, I should probably fix that and say it doesn't have an ensure search parameter in FHIR core. So if you were to actually try and do an include on an explanation of benefit using FHIR core, you can't actually get your ensure um, because it's just not a search parameter that's in the base spec. But CarnBB has that and has implemented that, so you can search a provider and insurer. I know I wrote issuer. I'll fix that later. Right. So I'll finish up the slides real quick, and then we'll look at actual API calls. So it's good to know when to use search parameters like include versus $everything. You may have heard $everything if you're looking into bulk export and bulk import. That's a huge thing down in the States. Basically, $everything is an operation that, like it says, gets you everything about the patient. And not only the patient, but the records that are also related to the records related to the patient. So for example, I'll get a patient and then I can get the explanation of benefit and then I can get the provider that's in that explanation of benefit all in one query. And so it kind of functions actually in the same way to Rev Include and Include, where Rev Include will search any resources that are referencing the patient that you're using and then include that in to your final bundle. Include will fetch anything that's already referenced in the patient record itself, like an organization. Why that matters is the outputs of these are functionally different. With $everything, it's because it literally gets everything. This means that the bundle that you get will always be growing and growing, and becomes unmaintainable for most member applications or anything that a patient would probably load on their phone, not because phones or whatnot can't handle it, but the pool of data that's being built will be so large because you're getting medical history for years, depending on how much historical data that you're using, that it's not really as helpful as you might think. The Where it really shines is getting that historical data for the user. If they're trying to send that data somewhere else, maybe a different insurer, or they're just trying to keep some sort of record, some sort of historical record of their medical journey from birth till wherever they are really. Whereas with include and rev include, because these are standard search parameters in FHIR, it's very easy to modify its behavior so you're really honing in on what you need. And you'll often, if not always, be using this in your applications when you're trying to get data related to a patient or a user, I should say, because it can also relate to practitioner. It can be related to fetching information from an immunization and all the other subsequent records that are associated with it. So it's fairly powerful. The FHIR search page doesn't, or FHIR search spec page does an excellent job of defining how how it all works together. And actually, I think I can share another GitHub link. Um, at HappyFire, Small CDR maintains HappyFire, and we've written tutorials about how to approach different aspects of the spec, including chains and reverse includes and whatnot, fire path, search parameters, and a bunch of other stuff. So I'll link that later to give people a chance to kind of read the spec, but a little parsed down based on our experiences. And again, it's on GitHub and open source and free for anyone to contribute as well. And FirePath. So FirePath is huge in that by utilizing FirePath, you can really narrow down on elements in your FHIR resource and filter out or build a proper expression if you're working with search parameters that help you with matching what you're looking for with what exists in your data. If you've ever written a search parameter, you'll probably see this expressions part. If not, lucky for you, I have one ready to go. And last slide before we get into actual APIs and looking at their outputs is GraphQL. So GraphQL is fairly popular outside of FHIR. It's very good at getting focused large sets of data, which is typically helpful if you have an application like Facebook, which uses this in order to get all the records and details about a Facebook user and also the data that they're putting on their feed. Oftentimes I see it used for analytics, but with FHIR, you're also able to use it to modify the data that you're actually trying to consume. So GraphQL is very helpful in that regard, where it'll allow you to flatten resources, allow you to modify the structure of your bundle, which isn't really a bundle in GraphQL, it's something else. But by doing that, you're able to build more focused data sets based off of FHIR data that you can then consume in your application. Now, for the astute, you're probably thinking, well, I can also do this with just using the elements modifier in my query. So what's the difference between the two? and that's a pretty good question. Elements in FHIR is a search parameter which allows you to actually change what gets returned back from a API call in the FHIR resource. So you can exclude things like meta if your application doesn't need it. You can exclude name and a bunch of other stuff. Um, with elements, what you're actually doing by the end of it all is returning the resource in its original structure, only excluding or including elements that you specify. Whereas with GraphQL, what you're really doing is returning a JSON structure, which is a representation of your FHIR data that you determine its structure based on what elements you'd like to include in that response. Um, and actually, you know what? The best way to illustrate this is with some API calls. So let's take a look at that. Um, so I'll start with a structure definition that for patient, and we'll look at that with no filters on it. So as you can see, this is the structure definition for patient, and yeah, it's kind of huge. It's close to 2,500 lines over here, so pretty massive in that regard. But maybe I'm querying this, and I don't really care for all of these elements, right? Structure definitions determine what cardinalities should be applied to the patient resource. So let's try filtering that a bit. Um, Specifically, snapshot contains all the elements and then what they're supposed to do, their cardinality, the path to the element and whatnot. So probably hard to see here. Let me make that a little easier and blow that up slightly. Um, what I'm doing is using the GraphQL modifier, and my query contains sections of my FHIR resource that I actually want to keep. And so I'm saying in my query, only return snapshot element, and in the element resource, return, or not resource, but the element object, return the ID, path, and cardinalities. In addition, I only want to look at the telecom values in contacts. So what does all that jargon mean? Well, by the end of it, we look at this, we start with this lovely wall of text, and we end up with a way more focused structure that we can look at. Um, and so I say it's like a bundle, but it's not, because depending on how you structure your query, um, you may be able to filter specific elements. Really, what you're getting by the end of it is a data object. And data will contain the result of your GraphQL, of the elements that you specified in your GraphQL call. So we could see, because I said, give me in the element object, give me the ID, the path, the min and max. That's all I'm getting. And anything in the structure definition that matches this gets returned here, and fairly quickly too. It's pretty elegant. I love using this when I'm writing applications that need to check specific structures or elements in an object. Things like questionnaire responses or document references are a very good example of that. Um, and by the end of it, I also get my telecom, which is what I specified earlier or later in my call, where I said, give me the telecom and flatten the objects a bit. So that way it adds a little more structure. Instead of building an array that has telecom objects that have system and value, it kind of cuts the middleman out of that and just gives you a telecom array with your objects that contain system and value. Um, Now, this is a pretty cool way of structuring your response to get focused data sets that you need. But you can also achieve the same thing using elements. So this one's a bit of a doozy. So let's hop into it a little. I'm going to look at the same structure, but what I'm saying here is give me with this elements modifier, give me every element that or actually return just the snapshot element min, return the element max, and also return the contact details. But also I want to exclude, oh, I can see why that messed up a little. There we go. element min, I want element max, I want the contact details, and I also want to exclude the metadata because I don't particularly care about the version ID and whatnot. So I'm going to take this, and then with any luck, we should get our FHIR resource back. Um, and notice that this time I'm getting the resource itself. This is what I was saying about elements returning the actual FHIR resource and not a representation of the structure. If you need to filter elements on your FHIR resource and you don't want to change the actual structure of it, not like GraphQL makes a permanent change. Again, it's just a representation. But if you need as close a representation to your data as possible, it's better to use the elements modifier on your query because right now I'm actually getting the structure definition resource, its ID, and then the contact array, which has telecom, the telecom array, which has the system and value objects in them. And then the snapshot here is actually the same structure that you would see in your actual structure definition. So it maintains its structure as closely as possible based on the constraints that I've put on this. This is very helpful if you're working, let's say, with document references. You can imagine some scans, maybe gigabytes worth of data in those images. So it doesn't make sense rather to always include those binary data in your object or your FHIR resource rather. What makes more sense is querying the document reference first and excluding the binary data in that object. And so that way, if the user needs to be able to download it, well, just do another get call to get the actual element, and then figure out how you want to actually download binary data from there. But by excluding that binary data, we save a ton of computational time because we don't have to load hundreds of document references with binary data in each of them. We can just, like we did here, just exclude those elements. And then that way, if you care also about its structure, you can keep it as is. Otherwise, you can kind of achieve the same thing with GraphQL. There is one big caveat that I want to mention for all this, is that GraphQL is only helpful really for querying data. And I would not use it to write data to a server because a lot of the times when I'm writing some of the applications that I'm using. For example, I'm using a library to build this object. This doesn't work well. I don't think there's a lot that works well with GraphQL in that you lose the ability to actually write or use strict typing when you're working with GraphQL and writing data. I find it's just more of a headache in that regard, and your code starts to not look standard because I can easily go in here and say, oh, human name matches the FHIR human name in the FHIR spec, and I can easily walk through and figure out that structure. But with GraphQL, because it's a representation of the data that you want to send, you lose that readability. And so from an operations and team management perspective, it doesn't make sense for me to use GraphQL for writing data. For reading, it's absolutely fine because again, I want focused data by the end of it. But for writing, just build resources as you would and post them as you would regularly for any application. One other thing that I wanted to mention. Oh yeah, FHIR paths. So I'm going to give an example of a Rev Include. So right now, let's walk through this bit by bit. Here's a patient A, lovely person. However, maybe I want their explanation of benefits in my application. I don't actually know what their explanation of benefit is here, right? Because the patient resource at most really makes references to other patients or person resources and a managing organization. So what can we do about that? Well, if I modify this query so that I add Rev Include, what I'm saying is look back at all the explanation of benefits and include an explanation of benefit that has the patient that I'm using in my query in the response. Bear in mind that when you're working with Rev Include and any of the search parameters, do not go into those search parameters and use, or rather don't look at the keys in the object and use that for your search. Maybe in chaining you can get away with that, but definitely don't do that. For example, birth date is one of my favorites because it's really easy to use. If I do something like birth date, right, like with the same casing, And I do, was it 1971, 06, 30. It doesn't actually know what birth date is. But if I do birth date, the search parameter, it works perfectly fine. So bear that in mind whenever you're querying or working with your search parameters. Do not use the object keys. I can't tell you how many times I have to fix broken searches because of this. Always pay attention to the search parameters. If you don't know, just Google what you want, go into the FHIR spec, and go all the way down to search parameters. It's always the last section in your FHIR object, in your FHIR definitions, or in the FHIR spec for a particular resource. This will be your source of truth for every standard search parameter. And again, if you don't find something here, you may have to write a custom one. But that's a little out of scope for today's discussion. Um, Anywho, what I want to do now is get that actual object back. So let's go back here. So I'm going to modify this so it lets me search for any patient with an ID. And then I'm going to reverse include any explanation of benefits that is related to this patient. And by the end of it all, I should get both my patient record and my explanation of benefit. Bear in mind, if you're using this, do not use total as your source of truth for how many records are in your bundle. The reason being is that total only cares about the elements that match the beginning of your query before anything like a Rev Include. It doesn't really care about other elements that are included. It only cares about elements that match the search modifier or the search or the search requirement is the word I want to use. So what does that mean? So let's go back to my query here. And I'm going to get rid of all this, right? And I have a patient on my system called patient B. So now what I'm doing is just getting any patient that has these two IDs. And you can see the total went up to 2 because there are 2 resources that matched everything in this equality check. But if I do that same query and I do a Rev Include, oh wait, sorry, went a little too far there because there's FHIR path expressions, but you can still see the total is still 2, even though I've included an explanation of benefit, or rather reverse included, because again, the total doesn't care about reverse included or included resources, only cares about resources that match the equality checks in your query. If you need an actual count of all your resources, there is something called a count search parameter that you can use. And again, that can be the only caveat is that anything that's cached may get returned first, which may be different than what's written in the DB, because caches may take a while to update to reflect any changes that are written to your database. So bear that in mind as well. There's a bunch of caveats with this. You could probably skip caches too, and then you're paying the price in terms of performance if you're counting a large data set. So it's really of you pick your poison, or you can't get your cake and eat it too when it comes to counts. Um, so just bear that in mind when you're structuring application logic around that. The part that I want to look at now that I think is pretty neat is FHIR path. So FHIR path basically allows you to walk through the resources that you're working with and either select or modify the output to what you want. So for example, actually, here's a really bad query for you. I'm going to change this Rev Include so that it just includes everything. And to do that, you just do a wild star. So now this Rev Include gets the explanation of benefit. It gets this is coverage. Yep. So it gets a coverage, and it should get a claim at some point as well. That might be a bit further up. But you can see that I'm getting all these resources. And while that's cool when you're testing in production, this is a very expensive query, very slow. Doesn't really help you in that regard to get everything. So what you can do is filter that. If you, for some reason, need everything, just use either specific FHIR resources that you want in your query, or if you have to do this, just use FHIR to help further filter the results. And so that way, now if I do that Rev Include equals star, and I say, give me only resources that are explanation of benefits, that's all I get in this bundle now. The astute probably probably saw that there's no patient record anywhere here. Um, this is part of the filtering logic, because I'm saying in the bundle, just give me explanation of benefits, which means in theory, I should see multiple explanation of benefits if I have multiples of them for my patient. But that also excludes the patient that I'm using in the beginning of my search. I actually think this is fairly helpful, because if you think about it, you probably already loaded the patient record in your view, so you don't really care about loading the patient record again. You mostly care about anything else related to the patient record. So I may be writing a function that builds this view and says, okay, now I need explanation of benefits to parse. So by doing this, I'm able to filter and modify this so it's a more focused, and um, I'm saving time in terms of what gets calculated and returned, and I'm saving effort on the application that's trying to parse it, because I know I can very easily determine what to expect in my bundle by doing this. We're getting close to time, and I do want to open questions up for a little bit. So the last thing I want to do is go back to tokens real quick. I know, kind of whiplash in terms of topics, but I promised that I'd show something about it. So I'm signing in, and this is the scopes that I have. So this view user profile is actually the FHIR user scope. This would be profile in standard OIDC. And then this is your refresh token scope to stay connected. And this is your patient read and your patient write permissions that you're giving. And the way to do that, I'm just going to open this real quick. So this is my application. And if you're just opening this to try and experiment with it, there we go. All of that is determined in scopes. So I'm saying, I'm a FHIR user, which is the patient scope or profile scope elsewhere. This is my refresh token scope. Give me the patient record ID in my token. This is standard OIDC. And then these are the patient read and patient write scopes. So this tells the application it has permission to execute read-write permissions. Note, it's not the same as the user being able to do read-write permissions, because again, that's not enforced here. The end result of this is if you only have a record or user that can do write access, or read access rather, and you have patient read write, they're only going to get patient read. The logic is that your final permission will be if you think of it like a Venn diagram and you have the two circles, it's the union of your scope and your user permissions. And that's what's going to be in the final result for your permissions, or for that session rather. So I'm going to authorize, and right off the bat, I can get when my tokens are expiring. This is my actual access token. I can copy that and use that for my application. And if we look at the claims, we can see there's that patient scope that I talked about earlier. So it's neat in that regard, is that I can write logic that easily goes back to my token, gets this patient ID, and then continues to do the rest for me. And that way, you're not doing extra checks to get the patient record, then get the ID, then plug the ID. You have it all in your token. And yeah, you can find the same details by just going to JWT or jot.io and copy pasting your access token into there. It's the same thing with the ID token, same structure, but or in terms of same structure for the token, but the actual claims are a bit different. You'll typically sometimes you'll see more descriptive details about the user in these ID tokens. And the part that I want to point out here is I'm also able, because of that FHIR user scope, able to get the related person resource for this. Truth be told, this one is not as useful to me as I'd like it to be. So in a production environment, I would script this to be different. But that option's there if you need it. And we can test if this claim is actually working by going into the FHIR data page. So I'm going to use the $everything operation just to kind of show that that's working. And we could see I can get all those resources that I talked about earlier. But let's now type a different query in. So I'm going to do get a patient, and I just want my patient record, right? So I'll just do this, and that works fine. However, if I try to do this, where I want to search by patient B, we get an access denied. And that makes sense because your scopes are only giving you permission to view your own record. And on the user level, I've written it so that it only gives them access to their compartments. So you want to think about it both ways. Build the application so that it securely only queries the patient in session, and structure your user accounts so that, or the permissions on those user accounts, so you can't do cross searches across other patient records. And for those who are curious, there is a default search state. If I do this, it just grabs the patient ID and then does a Rev Include. So this is what I was talking about earlier. Use your token to your advantage. I can just click a button and the application will know, go into the token, get the ID, build the query, and make a call to the server. And we get that here. And I think that's about it for what I want to talk about today, only because there's more, but I want to open the floor to questions at this point.
Thanks, Omar. I haven't seen any questions specifically come through the chat. So this is your opportunity, folks. If you have, anything specifically that Omar's deep dived into, or just generally in this space, drop them in the chat. We'll read them out. And I think we've got about 4 more minutes. So this is your opportunity.
I mean, if we have 4 more minutes, I could talk about my cat, but I don't think that's an efficient use of time.
Well, one question I had, so when we first started chatting, you've been showing kind of the repo that you have, Swiss on FHIR. You said there was another repo that you wanted to drop the link for. Is that related to the other components that you were thinking you might chat through originally?
Yeah, so I'm trying to send the link. Well, BVO, it takes a lot of time, a lot of beard to grow, but we got there eventually. Just get a nice beard, and I think you'll be fine. Yeah, so there was FHIR TS. I'm trying to link things in the chat, but it won't let me.
Yeah, basically, I just had to retype it. So if
right, so let me then happy FHIR tutorial. Yes, so I can send this to you after this call if you'd like.
Okay. Yeah, and again, it's going to be recorded. So as long as folks, have access to those recordings, this is another way that they'll get that. But I think any resources that we can provide are ideal.
Yeah, so this is in our Happy FHIR project. So this is not owned by Smile. This is our community. Here's how you do things in FHIR approach. So we have chapters on transactions and CRUD, search parameter types, profiling, code systems, quite a lot. And if you feel like there's more that you'd like to contribute, again, by all means, feel free to do so. We're happy to collaborate and work with everyone. Same thing for Swiss. If you're getting started and you need a way to figure out if your tokens or your API calls are connecting to your system efficiently, feel free to download this, try it, make a pull request if you have something you'd like to add. Yeah, the more the merrier, I think. If everyone gets their hands involved and pokes around, I think they'll have a fun time with FHIR. I know I did. I mean, that's why I'm here, right?
Right. And it's impressive what you've been able to put together. I'm curious if you feel like, because partly it sounds like what you've developed has been out of your own needs as a user. Are there other items as you look at, kind of expanding out the documentation that you really would like to start working in that we might expect in the future that are kind of intuitive evolutions in the space to what users need?
Yeah, I think one thing we'll start seeing soon is the shift towards a more approachable type of the spec. I know for users, especially when I started in this, it was very hard to kind of parse everything. I mean, you're not expected to read every resource that's on this page, obviously, but because there's so much, and FHIR is written by people with decades of experience in healthcare IT. Like I said before, experts suck at explaining what they know because they look at it from a top-down view. So I think as FHIR's adoption will grow, so will the approach, so will the change to FHIR will also, or sorry, the approach to FHIR will change as the community grows, because we get new people that bring fresh views
Yep.
And have different necessities that they want to cover. And so I feel like we'll see that flourishing, especially in some jurisdictions that are mandating FHIR. I can see that growth happening pretty quickly.
Yeah, and we're seeing it even in our numbers of the conference and the shift in
Mhm.
the folks that this is bringing in. So we're really excited to be part of this space, and as I'm sure you are. Well, I want to thank you for your time and for the content you've been able to kind of provide insight on today. I am just going to do a quick plug for the closing cleanout at 4, and I know that there may be other folks that are retrying their networking sessions if folks want to poke around after the call ends. Otherwise, I thank you so much for your presentation, and happy FHIR North, everyone.
Thank you all.
Cheers.